It's entirely reasonable and even quite appropriate, in my opinion. This is purely my opinion that I'm sharing with you. For somebody who is going through a transient, a short-term, and probably, exogenous, externally caused emotional crisis. For example, their spouse dies. Or for some people, it might be their pet dies. I mean, it just, or their marriage falls apart, or a long-term relationship, or they lose their job, or they're losing their home. The banksters have stolen their home. It's entirely appropriate, for such a person to feel really bad, really depressed, really upset, and sometimes even to think about suicide. I mean, that just happens. That's part of the human condition. And it's also, I think, appropriate with great care for a physician or a psychiatrist to intervene with such a person using appropriate medication. I know that, I can't say that as an absolute assertion, but I believe that Dr. Bregan would probably disagree with that and say there's almost no time when a medication would be appropriate, that if you have to sit there and hold their hand all day, do it. I'm sort of, a little, I don't see this as black and white. The thing that concerns me is that when you look at the double-blind placebo-controlled studies for these antidepressants, what you find is that the placebos are typically in the within a few points of being just as effective as the antidepressants themselves. In other words, you give somebody a pill and you tell them that it's going to work, and their brain will make it work. The placebo effect is absolutely astounding. It even extends to things like severe pain. So, number one, there's, in my mind, not a large body of truth that these drugs are all that effective. At least these very subtle drugs that take weeks to come on and alter serotonin chemistry in the brain. Now, I could see the more short-term acting drugs being used for something like this. Perhaps the benzo drugs. I realize people are freaked out about those things, the old Valium and Xanax. But even there, I mean, there's such a potential for habituation and addiction, and withdrawal can be so severe from those things that if you've got somebody on them for more than a week, you're wandering into dangerous territory. So, but even those drugs don't dull affect as much as they just basically, deal with anxiety. They're more anti-anxiety drugs than antidepressant drugs. And I don't think that there are any genuinely antidepressant drugs out there that don't have the potential to kill affect, to kill the ability to feel emotions. And, when really awful things happen, it's entirely appropriate to feel emotions and even to be overwhelmed by those emotions. In fact, it might be an important part of the healing, and in many cases is. So while there may be some cases, and I would acknowledge that there may be some cases where it's appropriate to intervene pharmaceutically, I really and truly think they're far and few between. I think they're a single-digit % of the number of people who are on these drugs. And the other big problem, particularly with the SSRI drugs, and this is one that we're going to see, just as we learned with the benzo drugs after the 70s, is that after a decade or so, people are stuck. I mean, back in the 60s and 70s, it was not uncommon for regular family docs to routinely prescribe Valium to mostly to housewives, actually. I know 3 different people whose mothers, back in the 70s when we were in our teens and 20s, whose mothers were on Valium. It was common. There was a book written about it, Valley of the Dolls. Was it Erica Jong wrote that? About women who were mixing up their drugs, and then they would get amphetamines to pick them up in the morning and benzos to calm them down at night and all this kind of thing. And, it seemed fairly harmless for a while. And then after a year or two, people were like, hey, I'm addicted. If I stop taking this stuff, I start getting electric shocks in my brain and deep, deep depression. Well, I predict that, I think it's already happening now, but as time goes on, particularly because the SSRI drugs cause things like impotence and disconnect people from emotions and thus damage relationships, or don't allow relationships to be fully experienced, don't allow people to fully experience life in its horrors or in its joys, that people start to say, I think I want to get off this drug. And then when they try to get off it, they find that it's like trying to quit smoking. I mean, it's really, really brutal, hard stuff to do. And the doctors are not facing up to this because, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. They make money writing the prescriptions. The pharmaceutical companies make a whole lot more money peddling the drugs. They're taking the doctors to conventions and training them, and there's a sense of everybody does it, so it must be okay. Just like back in the 60s and 70s, among doctors, there was a sense of, oh yeah, everybody's prescribing Quaaludes, everybody's prescribing Valium, it must be okay. And it turns out it wasn't okay. They don't even make Quaaludes anymore because so many people went off the edge on them. The same thing with the barbiturate drugs, Seconal and butabarbital. And the Amitol, I don't remember the names of them. There's a bunch of them. But when I was 18 years old, there was a friend of mine who was depressed. And, Clark and I found his body. I mean, he died from an overdose of barbiturates, which I'm pretty sure was unintentional. He was mixing barbiturates and alcohol on a Saturday afternoon. And it wasn't a massive dose that he had taken. I mean, most of the pill bottle was sitting right there next to him full. So we just, so they don't prescribe those anymore.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 866-987-THOM.
In fact, the barbiturates, those are the drugs that they're using for physician-assisted suicide now in Oregon and Washington State. I mean, dangerous stuff. So what are we going to know about these drugs, these SRIs, in 10 years?